friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're moving on well, and I believe you're learning as much as I am also learning. As I teach, I also get to learn. I am one of you. The challenges that all of us have with money, I also sometimes have the same. And so we are learning, all of us. There's no one who is ahead of the other. The idea is to keep learning, to keep educating one another, to keep sharing. Today, as we continue looking at the subject of debt, I would like us to address the subject of emergencies. There are times when emergencies will happen. And you will tell me, Lucy, as much as you're telling us that when we borrow, we become slaves of the lenders, as much as you're discouraging us to borrow to acquire liabilities, an emergency has happened. Someone is in the hospital. My car has an accident. This and the other has happened. So what should I do? I have no alternative but to run to a debt. But wait a minute. Is running to a debt the only option that you have in the event of an emergency? And I would like to tell us that a prudent person, if we are going to be intentional the way we are saying about approaching the future, then the first place where we begin with our financial planning is creating an emergency fund. What is an emergency fund? It is that fund, that amount of money that we have kept somewhere that is going to be our fallback when emergencies happen, so that then we avoid the issue of running to borrow money when we are desperate. And you know, when you're desperate, everything goes. You'll be given the money, yes, as a debt, but it will come at a very high cost. So what am I saying? I'm saying that we are going to be intentional about creating an emergency fund. And an emergency fund is the equivalent of 3 to 6 months of your monthly upkeep, kept somewhere in a safe fund that you can access within the shortest of notice, either 24 hours or 48 hours or a day or two. That fund must be accessible to you within the shortest period. So what you're going to do is you're going to sit, do your calculation. How much money do you spend for rent, for food, for everything every month? So then you're going to go about now creating a fund that can sustain you for at least 3 months on the minimum and up to 6 months. So for instance, if you do your budget and realize that you need, say, 20,000 to last you from beginning of the month to the end of the month, then for 3 months you need at least 60,000 sitting somewhere where you know, if I ever get into an emergency, this money is available for me. And in the new year, we are going to look at where are some of those places where you can keep that emergency fund. Briefly, it can be in a savings account that you can access easily, but not the account where you your operational account where regularly you go to remove your money. It must be called like that, emergency fund. So it's either in a savings account or in a money market fund. And I'll tell you in subsequent recordings who are the suppliers of money market funds where you can keep that money, so that at least, even if it is an emergency, it is earning some interest for you as it is waiting. So build an emergency fund so that in the event of an emergency has happened, then you don't have to run to borrow money. The second thing that you can do is create a buffer for yourself. And how do you create a buffer for yourself or a fallback plan? A lot of us belong to chamas. And we know some of those chamas, there's that little amount of money that we normally changa, and it becomes now our emergency kitty. An emergency has happened. Before I think of going to borrow money from the bank or from mobile loans, then I can go to my chama and borrow that from that emergency kitty. There are many chamas that have that. And if you're here, you're listening to me, your chama doesn't have that, then that is something that you need to introduce to your chama, where on top of the merry-go-round, on top of the amount that you raise for investments, then you can create an extra fund where everybody contributes something little, 50 shillings, 100 shillings, 500 shillings, depending on your abilities as a group. And that money then is kept in an account. So if there's an emergency, you can go there and you're allowed to borrow up to a certain amount without interest. So that's money that is accessible to you, and normally you don't charge interest because that is the purpose. The purpose for that amount, that account, is to cater for the emergency of the chama members. So you have that. The third thing that you can look at is if you're in the circle, if you're in any savings and credit circle, most circles will always allow an emergency loan. And that emergency loan, sometimes up to 100 or up to 50,000, it is accessible to you within 48 hours or within 3 days of completing an application form. So that is somewhere you can also run to get an emergency fund. So am I talking to you and probably you're not even a member of the circle? I am inviting you now to start considering becoming a member of the circle, because most circles have that facility where their members can run to them within the shortest of notice and you can access an emergency fund. Once you borrow that emergency fund, then you're given probably 6 months to 1 year to repay that amount. And most of the times we'll repay that amount. Sometimes they don't charge any interest, or even if they charge an interest, then it is negligible interest. But that you can only access if you are a member of that circle. If you're not a member, then unfortunately you are left with nowhere else to go except now to think of those other places that will give you emergency loans at very high interest rate. So what have I said? For today, in the event of emergencies, we are saying, even if as of now you don't have an emergency fund, going forward, think about creating an emergency fund. And the emergency fund should cater for 3 to 6 months worth of your monthly expenses. That is what we call an emergency fund. Should an emergency happen and you liquidate that fund, then your priority becomes rebuilding the emergency fund so that at all times that fund is there. In the event of an emergency, you know that is your first point of call. The second place of call is creating a fallback plan or a buffer utilizing the chama opportunity. Most of us in Kenya belong to chamas. Make sure your chama has got that facility for emergencies. And the third one is now borrowing from the circle. If you're a member of the circle, they will allow you to borrow an emergency fund. So if on the unfortunate circumstance that you don't have any of those three, then that is when you might have to run now to the mobile phone apps, you might have to run to the bank, you might sometimes even have to run to the Shyrox to borrow the money from them. But unfortunately, when you do that, you have to be aware that the cost of that borrowing is normally very, very high. So going forward, let us be intentional. I have said we will use debt to build ourselves, we will use debt to scale ourselves, but all we are saying is, even as we are using debt, let us be prepared for emergencies. So thank you so much. Continue watching, continue following. Let's continue learning. Continue visiting our YouTube channel. Continue visiting our Facebook pages. Continue liking, continue sharing. Let us all continue to learn. We are not leaving anyone behind. We are going, all of us, and we are approaching the future from this point of view that is very, very intentional. We want to look at ourselves 3 years from now. Will we be still giving the same narrative? I am burdened by debt. I am out of control completely of my finances. Or can we change the narrative and be in control of our personal finances? Because that is how ultimately we shall create financial freedom. So thank you so much. See you next Wednesday.